Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Kiev regime stuck between a rock and a very hard place. With the Europeans and Russians pushing the Ukrainians to finally implement the Minsk Accords, there's growing evidence the Maidan political forces are turning against themselves. All the while, NATO continues to target Russia. To CrossTalk Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Alexander Mikiris, here in the studio. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. We also have Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. And in Washington, we cross to Nebojsa Malic. He is a foreign affairs columnist as well as a news writer for RT America. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Mark, if I can go to you first here. I wanted to start out by talking about the Normandy format. The leaders of Ukraine, Germany, France, and Russia will be meeting in Paris to discuss the next stage, if there is a next stage of the Minsk agreement. But something happened Thursday that I think is more important right now. You know where I'm going. On
Thursday evening, the president of the Putsch regime in Ukraine, the oligarch Poroshenko, signed a decree blacklisting, banning from the Ukraine a list of 388 individuals, 100 companies, 100 organizations. The list goes on and on. It's supposedly in the midst of a peace process right now. The most sensational thing about this list is not that, the hundreds of celebrities, the whole rationale for this list is that these people, these companies, these organizations present a national security threat to Ukraine such that they should be banned from the country.
So that includes journalists?
It includes journalists, in particular, because no one cares about the Russian journalists who have banned from Ukraine for a year plus now. There were 3 BBC journalists that the entire Western media last night was racking their brains, trying to figure out why then they were on this list, because at least one of them had ridiculously Slavish coverage of the Maidan protests and the aftermath of it. The Western journalists went crazy last night on the Twitter sphere, in print. Just demanding that they be removed. Not a word about the Russian journalists.
Okay, Artis Ripley was on that list here. Alexander, let me go to you. So to kind of echo what Mark is saying here, because Western journalists are barred, it must mean it's a sensational story. Bit of a double standard, yes?
Well, there's a huge double standard because let's not forget that not only have Russian journalists been banned over the course of the Ukrainian crisis, many of them have been killed as well, and there's been signs that they've been deliberately targeted for
11
killing.
journalists and media workers, not only from Russia, from Italy, from across, have been murdered since this government took power, and all of them were reporting critically of the government. Some of them were killed by military action in the Donbass. Others were openly assassinated in the streets of Kiev.
Okay, let me go to Nebojsa in Washington. Nebojsa, it would appear that if you represent a Western news outlet, your freedom of speech is more valuable than the speech of other people.
Well, that's been the whole approach all along. If you're a Western journalist, you have freedom of speech. If you're anybody else, you're an unperson, period. Just like the Western media has never cared about any of the people who died in Donbass because they're unpersons in their mind. What I find amusing in this entire spectacle is that the Western media jumped immediately after this blacklist came out saying, but why target us? We're on your side. Well, nice of you to say so after pretending to be objective for 2 years.
Mark, pick up on that.
Yeah. I actually engaged with Western journalists last night in the Twitter sphere and calling them out on their hypocrisy. And they were quite open. And in particular, even a BBC journalist, Daniel Sanford, who used to be a Moscow correspondent, that they don't regard Russian journalists as being banned as important because they are not honored and respected. They are like the BBC journalists, they are propagandists, unlike the state propagandists who work for the BBC.
Okay, but at the same time, Alexander, we see Western journalists never questioning the reportage coming out of the 10 Downing Street or the White House or the U.S. State Department.
Or indeed out of Kiev quite a lot of the time. I can remember the BBC during the fighting last August, not August of 2014, publishing a map which showed all the advances the Ukrainian army was doing. And of course, it wasn't making those advances. It was giving a completely false impression of the progress of the war because it was based on what Kiev was saying. And of course, it's followed the Kiev narrative right through the whole conflict. And it has completely distorted the impression that people in Britain have of the war. And I think one has to be clear about this.
Okay, Naboish, if I can go to you, change gears here. I started out by talking about the Normandy format. What can we expect here? Because it's pretty clear that the Merkel and Hollande are losing patience, if I can put it that way, with the Ukrainian president. I mean, he signed up to an agreement, a set of agreements to end the civil war in Ukraine, and he hasn't done squat. What's happening now? I mean, what's going to happen next? Because we also had last week, we had violence in Kiev. I mean, Poroshenko's really stuck between a rock and a hard place here. How is it going to play out? Go ahead.
Well, unfortunately for Merkel and Hollande, they've sort of been saddled with a different crisis much closer to home right now, and I don't think much as they've lost patience with Poroshenko and this albatross around their neck that the U.S. hung with Ukraine, they're dealing with a somewhat bigger problem of 800,000 Merkel's children, so to speak, flooding across the border. So I think they're going to be a little busy, a little preoccupied with that for the time being, and I think that's the reason the junta in Kiev is feeling like it can do whatever it wants, and also that it has unequivocal backing of the United States.
Mark, we've talked many times on this program here, you know, how because the Americans play lip service to Minsk. They don't really have it. They didn't buy into it. They don't talk it up. They only mention it when they have to. They're still pushing Poroshenko to go in one direction, while the Europeans are pushing him in another direction.
Yeah, the continual talk now is about the interpretation of Minsk, as if some of the statements that are quite clear can be
they're all
interpreted.
Single sentences, or very simple.
They continue to deny any political relations, any dialogue, any compromise. They refuse to sit down with the leaders of Donbass and work out a political compromise that would bring the Donbass back into the Ukraine, both in local elections and as this ban that Poroshenko signed into law demonstrates. They banned the leaders of the Donbass that they are supposedly in a peace process with, and that they are supposed to meet for negotiations and political compromise. Well, that shows how much respect, how much faith, how much we can expect out of the Minsk process when they are banning the very people that they are supposed to be negotiating
Alexander,
with.
last time I saw the Ukrainian president speaking to Western media, he was talking about how Ukraine wants to end its war with Russia, which of course is a distortion of what we're having, what's being played out on the ground right here. Also, one of the things I think that's, again, this rock in the hard place metaphor, is that indeed the Minsk Accords demand that the people of the Donbass be given more autonomy. The problem with that is, if you know Ukrainian history, is there other regions of Ukraine may ask for exactly the same thing. This is a Pandora's box.
Well, of course it is. And if I can just say something about Minsk, I think Minsk is something of a fiction, actually. It's a fiction which everybody pretends to believe in, but nobody really does. The only conceivable way that there could be a breakthrough is not if people like Merkel and Hollande meet with Poroshenko, because they meet with Poroshenko and things are agreed and nothing ever really happens. It is, in fact, if people in Ukraine start talking to each other. And, of course, that isn't going to happen. And partly it's because if it did start to happen, yes, there are other regions within Ukraine that might start demanding autonomy, not just eastern regions, western regions too.
In fact,
but there is
recent polling shows us that actually the demand for decentralization is higher in Western Ukraine than it is in Eastern Ukraine.
But there's also an ideological dimension to this, which is that the people who are in charge of the Maidan revolution, their conception perception of Ukraine is not of a Ukraine that recognizes these differences between Ukrainians. They have a very clear vision of a united, solidified, monocultural Ukraine.
But that's unrealistic. Nabosh, if I can go to you, this is the real problem here, because if you look at how this regime came to power through a coup, overthrowing a democratically elected government with at least the tacit support of the United States, there's plenty of evidence of that. But the problem is with this whole Minsk process is that this regime doesn't know what the word compromise is about. Either it's all or nothing, and it's ideologically driven with some of the most spurious ideological views. I'm talking about neo-fascist and whatnot elements within the regime. They don't understand compromise, and this is why the Minsk Accord in many ways is a dead letter. And as Alexander Makiris put it, at least we can all pretend as long as it doesn't get out of control. Go ahead.
Well, the thing about Minsk is that it provided a ceasefire necessary to stabilize things, I think, on both sides that for what different reasons wanted it paused. But the reason the Banderist regime was put in place to begin with is that its ideology does not believe in compromise. Its ideology is we are right, the rest of you can die. And that's why it was put into place. It wasn't. This has been a problem from the get-go. As one of my esteemed colleagues pointed out, the problem is the Ukrainians need to start talking to each other, but the regime won't let them. The people in Donbass, the people in Odessa, the people in Mariupol, they peacefully demonstrated against the coup last year before the regime sent tanks against them, and there's footage of people barehanded holding back tanks. And these people were declared terrorists, and the government started persecuting them and shelling their cities and starving their children. And this was A-OK with the West because, you know, the Maidan regime are not neo-fascists, they're democratic reformers. And until that fiction goes away, nothing can really happen. Because as long as the government in Kiev believes it can do whatever it wants because it has blanket support from the West, from the United States, from the UK, from
okay, Nabosh, I'm going to have to
European
jump in here.
Gentlemen,
we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Ukrainian civil war. Okay, Mark, I'd like to go back to you. On many editions of this program, when we've talked about Ukraine, we've brought up the issue of agency. And since we discussed so much about Western media coverage of this conflict, this internal conflict in Ukraine, the people of the Donbass are not given agency. They're not people. They're not people that can act out on their own. This is one of the most important myths that needs to be addressed when looking at this conflict.
This was one of the ideological keys of the Maidan, to seize power and then to rewrite Ukrainian national identity with a wholly Western Ukrainian interpretation of Ukrainian identity. And that meant denying the people of Eastern Ukraine any voice and any political representation, banning their parties, lustrating the legitimately elected officials who had been in government, and so on, all in order to silence them and acquiesce them. And the military campaign, of course, is part of that. And I brought this in today because I want to show you and the viewers. This is an example of the poisonous ideology towards the people of Eastern Ukraine that is present in the country today. And it's something you won't see on the Western media. They won't report about this. This is a billboard off of the street in Kherson in southern Ukraine, right next to the Crimea, actually. And it reads, separatism, Russophilia, federalism. There's a way out. And then it shows a picture of hands behind bars. And it says, we will cure you of your love from Russia. And this is an official billboard of the security services of Ukraine. This shows that the real goal here is not just to silence the people of East Ukraine, but it's actual political ethnic cleansing of them. They're not allowed to have a voice. If you even express an opinion towards federalism of the Ukraine, you are an enemy that needs to be put behind bars or otherwise dealt with, to be cured of.
I mean, Neboisha, none of this is strange to you. I think there's a nice repetition here. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly has an echo. I hear echoes of the breakup of Yugoslavia.
I've lived through all this 20 years ago in Bosnia. I mean, the whole notion of imposing artificial history. I mean, I want to be charitable to Western Ukrainians and say it's not really their fault. This whole poisonous ideology was concocted by Austria-Hungary over 100 years ago, together with the blue and yellow flag that was a flag of a particular Habsburg regiment. And the whole thing was cooked up in Vienna as a way to ensure that the Galician provinces remained loyal to the Austrian court. And here we have people, 100 years later, they're murdering their own kinsmen over an ideology cooked up by an empire that's been dead for 100 years, and it's occasionally pops up like an evil vampire to claim its bloody due. I've lived this thing in Bosnia, and it's almost the exact same situation. You have a population that's absolutely not prepared to compromise, and the bloody war continues until its foreign backers force it to abandon its maximalist aspirations, and all of a sudden there's peace, and then these people grumble that they were betrayed and that the world conspired against them. And
until they force them to abandon these ideas, or if I'm going to Alexander, until the entire thing completely falls apart, and then you start pointing fingers. And we obviously know where the fingers are going to be pointed.
Well, indeed. If we talk about the entire population, I think opinion polls in Ukraine, which I don't think are terribly reliable for all sorts of reasons, tend to suggest that most ordinary Ukrainians want peace and they want compromise. The difficulty is the political system, which is becoming increasingly unpopular and discredited, doesn't allow for that option, just as it isn't apparently capable of restoring the economic situation or of sorting out the corruption. In fact, it is based on corruption, and it is not obviously capable of negotiating with people in the East. So we have a very dangerous situation where a political system which is clearly failing is not really opening up options. And when that happens, there is a serious risk of the whole thing tumbling down and of something incredibly dangerous
we've already
coming
begun
out.
to see that with the hand grenade event of the very recent past, where 3 people were killed on in front of the Parliament when a law was being addressed about a level of federalism here. Where has that gone from here? Because is there going to be a trial? I mean, are these people going to be
there has been no
justice?
real accountability. It has vanished off the front pages. The political leaders who instigated, the leaders of the Svoboda and Right Sector Party, have gone quietly out of the front pages of the newspapers. There will be maybe the person who actually threw the grenade or perhaps fired the guns that supposedly were fired, who actually killed. And again, this was National Guardsmen killing other National Guardsmen. This wasn't one right, ultra-right faction against the government. This was ultra-right faction against the ultra-right government. And polls show that this is actually not a fair representation of the people of Central and Western Ukraine. Quite clearly, this government is not a popular government, despite supposedly being a people's revolution, as it is depicted in the Western media. It is incredibly unpopular. The sitting prime minister has approval ratings in the single digits, right? And the president of the regime is not much more popular himself. Every major figure in this government is incredibly unpopular with the Ukrainian people.
But it counts how popular you are in Washington, I suppose. Neboisha, let me go to you, because I think it's really interesting here is that this program, this television station has been criticized for calling out what is and what the nature of the regime in Kiev. And as Mark Sloboda, and I'm going to give Mark credit for it, is that he said they're all right-wingers. That's the problem here. I mean, don't look for too many differences. I mean, they're just shades of the same color right there. And I think that's a very important distinction that viewers have to understand, is that there is a motivating ideology in power in Kiev, and it doesn't want to compromise with other forces. Again, this is why Minsk isn't going to work out, and ultimately why this whole thing is going to crash in on itself. Again, as I pointed out, then the finger pointing will start, and we know where that'll go. Go ahead.
Well, as long as the government in Kiev that is praised by Washington as democratic reformers remains in the political spectrum of the 50 Shades of Black, this is all we can expect from them. War, war, and more war, killing each other, killing journalists, killing dissenters, banning difference of opinion, and then crying democracy. This is absurd. I mean, it's a theater of the absurd that should be intuitively obvious to any sort of casual observer. But thanks to the Western media that are covering this and are pretty much stenographers for the Kiev regime, just like they're stenographers for their own, the population in most Western countries thinks that, this is some sort of evil Russian aggression or whatnot. And then these very same reporters that are dutifully perpetuating this picture get banned and then start crying, well, why did you do this? We've been on your side all along. It's just a very, very sordid tale that I couldn't have come up with it in science fiction, and yet here we have it.
This is probably the only program that you'll actually hear anything about it. Remarkably, mark my words, I don't think anybody else will touch this. It's an obvious story, a story of obvious double standards, but they can't report that in the West because their entire narrative will start collapsing here. Alexander, let me go to you. When we look at the blockade against the Donbass in every sense, why in the world would these people want to remain in Ukraine?
Well, I'm sure many of them don't. In fact, I'm sure most of them don't, actually. I think if they had the choice, if they were given the choice, they would want to leave Ukraine by now.
But even the Kremlin isn't giving them that choice.
This is exactly the problem. This is why I said it's a fiction which nobody believes in, because the people of the Donbass, the leaders of the Donbass, are going ahead with Minsk. But the people of the
elections
and the people of the Donbass really, I don't think, are really sold on Minsk, actually. I think they would far prefer to leave Ukraine forever and behind them. And I have a feeling in the end that is how it's going to happen. I don't think this is a sustainable position at all. And I think if you want to criticize Russian policy, its problem is that I don't think it is also looking fully at the realities in Ukraine itself. I think it's been too optimistic in thinking a diplomatic solution is possible.
But that's a very interesting position, and Mark and I always have disagreed on this. There is plenty of disagreement here.
Yes.
Is that to what degree is Russia take ownership for Ukraine's problems? And I think that's the political calculus here.
Okay, well, part of, again, the problem that I have with that is Vladimir Putin 3 times publicly said that it is his responsibility to protect the people of the Donbass. And at least for 8,000 of them, he hasn't fulfilled that. That is my issue there.
But you can't say it's his fault that these people are dead as well.
He shouldn't have claimed responsibility for them. I think a great many of them did indeed rose up because they expected some greater level of support than what they have gotten, certainly less than what the Western media depicts it as. And the question is, where do we go from here? And the Minsk is not going to be fulfilled. I think this list banning, the actual purpose for it now is inflammatory. It is meant to enrage the Russian government again and to get them to once again take military action, hopefully to take Donbass off their hands, because they don't actually want.
You can't enrage the Russian government when it comes to Ukraine here. Nebojsa, we got about 40 seconds left. Where do we go from here? Everyone is very dubious about Minsk. I don't think I have as much skepticism because that's the only thing we've got. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's fulfilling its purpose, which is to freeze the situation and buy time for processes to develop, for Donbass to fortify, for Ukraine to fall apart on its own, because Banderism cannot survive without a war, and we're seeing that happen. So far it's working. Yeah, it's a terrible thing to say to people who have died in all the ceasefire violations, but this is better than open warfare.
Alexander, 20 seconds.
Well, I think that's probably true, but at the same time, I wonder whether that was actually the intention behind of the people who wanted to do Minsk. I don't think there was a plan to break up Ukraine. I think that's probably what it will come to.
I think that's what it will come to. All right, gentlemen, many thanks to my guests here in Moscow and in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
Yeah.
that this will not be signed. I love you.